I've been reluctant to make this video for a while, but a lot of you have either asked me directly about this or left weird propaganda in my comment sections. The comments on this one are going to be spicy. So today I'm answering, is modern Hebrew a made-up European colonizer constructed language with more relation to Esperanto and Klingon than to Semitic languages like Arabic? Is it the revival of a dead language in the world's first successful large-scale indigenous decolonial land-back movement? Is it an ancient language that never really died? Or something else? There's a lot of narratives out there about modern Hebrew, and unsurprisingly, they have a lot to do with shaping political and theological narratives about the state of Israel. The actual linguistic and historical facts don't really align nicely with any of the simple narratives, at least not the ones that I see online. As an exercise, if you read the comments, pay attention to how many negative comments on this don't engage with any of the actual content, but repeat thought-terminating cliches. That's the technical term from the science of cults. Today, I'm unpacking all of the noise and hot air around modern Hebrew. I'm going to present the facts, and I'm going to upset people on both sides. It's getting to be kind of my thing. If you're new to the channel, I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I've got a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, and on the channel, I discuss everything related to language, linguistics, language learning, and culture. If you're into those topics, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. This is going to be fine. This is Language Jones. Before anything else, I have to clarify two things. First is that there is a wealth of scientific evidence that repeating dis and misinformation actually reinforces it, even if it's in the context of busting a myth. So that format of myth, the moon is made of cheese. Fact, the moon is actually not made of cheese, it's made of rocks. People erroneously think the moon is made of cheese because nobody had ever been there. That format, that's basically just repeated and reinforced the myth about cheese 3 times, and the truth once, incidental to repeating the myth. This is what a lot of Jewish influencers and Holocaust education and anti-racists get wrong, and they end up doing the bigots' work for them. Now, it's a fine line to walk in this video because at the end of the day, I'm responding to misinformation that's already out there. By the way, now's as good a time as any. Misinformation is something that is wrong, but maybe believed by the person sharing it and not intentionally malicious. Disinformation is an intentional, malicious lie. Often it's hard to tease apart which is which, and a lot of misinformation people unwittingly spread can have its start in an intentional disinformation campaign. And that brings us to the other clarification. I'm making a point of discussing the scientific method on my channel as much as possible. We don't need a deep dive for this video, but the basic idea is that instead of steel-manning whatever idea you had, a scientist will come up with a testable idea about how the world works and then work as hard as possible to disprove that idea. The best you can do in science is fail to disprove. Okay, but maybe I'm biased and I've fallen prey to misinformation. Let's get the discussion of bias out of the way first. Some of you know that I'm a Jew. Some of you know I wasn't always. Unless you know me in real life, you probably don't know my family history, which is exciting and complicated and a story for another time, but the short version is that my grandmother just narrowly got out of France in 1939 thanks to a convoluted story involving birthright citizenship in the US and a mystery man from Virginia, and her ancestry was a mystery the family buried. But she was not white enough for the Nazis. So I have a family history shaped by the Holocaust, and I wasn't raised Christian in the United States. But I also wasn't raised Jewish. Came to that later in life. And the hashkafa, the outlook of the community I'm a part of, is one of Torah Umada, Torah and modern science. The Rambam, aka Maimonides, aka Maimon ibn Musa, we'll get to Judeo-Arabic and the linguistic and grammatical treasure trove from the Islamic Golden Age and the Jewish it was okay age later in the video. But Maimonides famously wrote, I'm paraphrasing, that when our understanding of our religious beliefs conflicts with our observations of, creation, that we have to update our incorrect beliefs to align with the observable world. Otherwise, what are you even doing? I don't want to get into the inside baseball of Jewish worldviews and theological arguments and whatever, but it's important to state that I am a scientist and that I don't take off my scientist hat when I put on my religious hat. They're the same hat. This is important to mention because some people are coming to this conversation with the sincerely held belief that Hebrew is the first human language, or that Arabic is the most perfect language because it's the language of revelation to Muhammad. And you have to recognize when you're having a completely different conversation. No amount of archaeology, historical attestation in other languages, comparative method, in short, science, is going to get through to those people. But for the rest of us, I think there's probably a lot of people out there who have questions about modern Hebrew because it is, in fact, unique, at least in the attested history of the world, as it currently stands. And there's lots of narratives about it that are plausible, seductive even, but also partially or entirely false. So let's start with what's mostly uncontroversial. Hebrew, old school OG Hebrew, is a Northwest Semitic language related to Ugaritic and Aramaic, and more distantly to Arabic, which isn't attested until much later. By the way, Ugaritic is super dope, and we know tons about it thanks to a massive cache of documents discovered in the early 20th century. It's closely related to Hebrew, but with a dope-ass cuneiform writing system. Of course, they used that to mostly write about Baal and shit, or to ask for help because the sea peoples were laying siege again or whatever. Anyway, we've got different stages of biblical Hebrew, and the text of the Hebrew Bible is a highly structured literary language that spans 1,000 years, not to mention an exile or two, and regional variation. But it's remarkably uniform given all that. For reference, here's English from 1,000 years ago.
Oft skyld shaving, tjäderna threatum, monegum maigthum mero settle oftea, egg so de erolas.
Theued Kuninga indeed. Hebrew originates in the Levant, basically between Edom and Ugarit, or modern-day Jordan and Syria, and was spoken in the kingdoms of Israel and Judea, which are now partially contiguous with modern Israel and Judea, or the West Bank, depending on what politically motivated terminology you want to use. In 323, Alexander of Macedon sweeps through. In 312, you get the beginnings of the Seleucid Empire. In the 2nd century BC, you have the Maccabean Revolt, which is the origin of the story of Hanukkah. There's a Hasmonean kingdom for a while that's sort of semi-autonomous client state. There's a civil war, and in 63 CE, one side calls in the Romans. The Romans do what the Romans do, and next thing you know, there's a revolt, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and the First Roman-Jewish War, a few more wars up through the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the ultimate dispersal of the Jewish people and beginning of true exile and diaspora. Oh, and the Romans renamed the whole area Palestina after a historical enemy of the Jews just to add insult to injury. By this time, for a variety of reasons, Aramaic is gaining ground. It's a sort of imperial lingua franca in the East, and the traditional story is that by 200 CE or so, Hebrew has died. The Jews speak Aramaic, later Judeo-Romance, then Judeo-German, aka Yiddish, Judeo-Spanish, aka Ladino, and of course Judeo-Arabic following the Arab conquest in places like Morocco, one of the Rambam's stomping grounds, Iraq, and so on. The story you've probably heard is that in the 1880s, suddenly European Jews take an interest in moving to the place the Romans renamed Palestine, and there's this one guy, Eliezer ben Yehuda, who more or less single-handedly revives Hebrew and makes it a modern language. Somehow it becomes the native day-to-day spoken language of a few million people, basically overnight. Now, does that sound a little weird? Like, Esperanto nuts are very motivated, and there's not that many of them. And there's a 1600-year lacuna there before sudden, intense interest. And the story we hear repeated is actually even stranger. I remember when I was younger, I actually stated out loud that I would never learn modern Hebrew because it was a conlang, a constructed language like Vulcan or Valyrian, spoken by a hyper-religious group of fanatics who had made a whole language out of retconning their fanfic for an ancient text, and that it was no different, really, than Klingon in that regard, other than it just being Bronze Age stuff. Turns out I was fucking stupid. But I didn't make that idea up on my own. I had heard a version of it repeated enough to think that it was plausible without, having done any research. So there's a few things to take into account. First, a lot of Jewish influencers are going to hate this, but yes, Hebrew did actually die, at least in the strict technical sense. When linguists talk about language death, they mean that it is the day-to-day home language used in all aspects of daily life, and this was simply not the case for the vast majority of Jews after about 200 CE. There were a few hangers-on in Palestine. However, that strict definition of language death is, well, very strict. People think that Hebrew just sort of disappeared, and it really didn't. First, it was the liturgical language of the Jews and continues to be. Jewish liturgy and ritual are performed in Hebrew, and sometimes Aramaic. Step into any synagogue in the world, and once you've cleared security, the reason that's needed is a whole separate conversation, you can hear people singing, reading, and speaking Hebrew. And Jewish life has always revolved around studying those texts, well, religiously. But remember that ritual part? I think a lot of non-Jews don't quite realize what Jewish ritual entails. It entails saying a statement of gratitude upon arising, saying a bracha over washing your hands in the morning, over using the bathroom, No, really. Over being ambulatory and dressed and healthy. It involves reading about 50 pages of Hebrew text in 20 to 60 minutes in the morning, every morning. It involves studying texts about a wide range of subjects in Mishnaic Hebrew, a later version of the language that was, yes, in some ways influenced by Aramaic, but not as much as you might think. Just how English was influenced by French, but is still a real language. It involves reciting a brief phrase before and after you eat, and it changes depending on what you eat. Saying a phrase upon seeing lightning, hearing thunder, seeing the ocean, smelling fragrant trees or grasses, seeing a person of unusual appearance. Side note, this is one of my favorites because you thank the creator for making different kinds of people in the world, and I think that's just beautiful. If you eat a meal with bread, you're saying like 4 full paragraphs about both eating and being satiated and wishing for a return to Zion. In the afternoon, there's another few dozen pages of Hebrew. In the evening, there's more. There's more before bed. On Shabbos and holidays, there's more. So Hebrew was and is the language of daily life and the rhythms of daily life for the Jews. So much so that languages like Yiddish use Hebrew terms for time sometimes, basic parts of the day, rather than their German counterparts. But beyond that, Hebrew was the lingua franca of the Jewish world. Maimonides, writing in the 11th century, wrote primarily in Arabic because he lived in Arab-conquered lands, except when he wanted it to be understood by all the Jews. Then he wrote in Hebrew. And those texts he wrote in Arabic, other contemporary Jews translated them in Hebrew so that Jews who were not living in lands under Arab domination could read them. During the Dark Ages, Jews were largely literate. As an aside, that's why the phantom time conspiracy is so hilarious to me. It was only dark in Christian Europe, and everybody else, not just the Jews, was writing up a storm. And a lot of that writing has survived to the present day. Anyway, for Jews in the Dark Ages, the language of education, international commerce, even poetry, was Hebrew. Before Eliezer ben Yehuda was even born, there were Hebrew newspapers and novels, Hebrew poetry by people like Ibn Ezra, who wrote around the turn of 1100, because he both knew Hebrew and expected other people to be able to read it. Now, it's also true that by the late 1800s, Hebrew didn't have words for all sorts of things. As one very biased blogger points out in his claim that Hebrew is entirely made up, it lacked words for the tomato and corn, for electricity. This is true. Of course, those were New World crops, and electricity only became relevant to the vast majority of people at the turn of the 20th century, but let's think about this. In the 18th and 19th and even 20th centuries, there were pushes toward standardization and modernization of languages, and it went hand in hand with nationalism. After like 1648 or so. Not only did French not have a standard form with words for all those modern things as well, the standardization of French and Italian and German and tons of other languages was a product of both nationalism and modernity. Yes, Hebrew didn't have a word for the tomato or for electricity until it did, like every other language. It's also true that modern Hebrew pronunciation differs from earlier varieties. Yemeni Hebrew retained a lot of the Semitic phonology shared with Arabic because, of course it did. If you're speaking a language with kaf and ayin all day, it's pretty easy to keep it when you switch to using Hebrew for everything. Modern Hebrew is a blending of Sephardic, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazi accents and phonologies that isn't really identical to any of them. This is also just kind of what happens when you throw hundreds of thousands of people together and then use a lingua franca. Then you get a supra-regional, supra-ethnic form traditionally referred to as a koine. They tend to have a simpler phonology, bracketing for the moment a definition of simple. Now, this is going to be a strong assertion, but it's well supported. All of the false claims about Hebrew that are anti-modern Hebrew, we'll get to pro in a minute, are really based in political and theological opposition to the return of the Jews to Zion, or to Jewish political sovereignty and self-determination in their ancestral homeland. So they get tied to strange conspiracy theories. The majority of the population of Israel is what would be considered people of color in the US and constitutes Jews who were ethnically cleansed from North Africa and the Middle East, along with a wide variety of other ethnic groups like the Druze, Bedouins, Sumerians, Alawites, and so on. And the minority of Jews in Israel who returned from exile in Europe have pretty much exclusively Levantine ancestry thanks to near total segregation imposed by, well, actual Europeans. Until Napoleon undid it, and then they all redid it, and then they undid it again in the Enlightenment, sort of at different rates at different places. But there are conspiracy theories that range from denying these facts and making false claims about mass conversion of white Europeans, conveniently before Europeans invented the concept of whiteness, specifically to the exclusion of the Jews during the Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
To making claims that Jews be non-human space aliens or lizard people or whatever. Was the subjunctive in that sentence really clunky? Yes, but it's important to not repeat that nonsense in the indicative, not just lest somebody take it out of context, but also so the absurd claim isn't what you remember as factually stated. The mass conversion thing is wild too, because anybody who knows European history knows that we're talking about a time when Europeans were riding into towns that they had segregated Jews into, raping, pillaging, murdering, and burning them to the ground. We're talking about the Crusades. So the anti-modern Hebrew claims fall into a few weird categories. I'm just going to address the facts. First, Semitic is a term European linguists, or really proto-linguists and philologists, made up to describe a language family, the one with Hebrew in it. It's not a term for genetic ancestry, and the term anti-Semitism was coined by a, anti-Semite, specifically because it sounded politer and more scientific than Judenhass, or hatred of the Jews. Hebrew is definitionally Semitic, even if we accept that there's a lot of loanwords and some grammatical changes, just like English is a Germanic language, despite having a ton of Romance language-derived vocabulary thanks to the Norman conquest. Hebrew was used on a daily basis by Jews before 1880 and before the modern political movements that fall under the Zionist umbrella, that being the desire for Jews to return to their ancestral homeland and exercise political self-determination. You should be aware that, yes, that is a different definition than what you get when you go to Wikipedia, and that's in part because there's just been a huge propaganda war raging in the edit pages of Wikipedia for years now. I'll leave a link in the description to an article about it. Not only was Hebrew not single-handedly revived by Ben Yehuda, but there were Hebrew language newspapers in circulation before he was born. In fact, there was a Hebrew language periodical called Hameasef, the Collector, that was published starting in 1784. Who do you think is reading these? Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who died in 1811, published a collection of Hasidic tales in a bilingual edition, Hebrew and Yiddish. Now, is it true that modern Hebrew borrowed or coined a lot of words? Absolutely, like every other language. One of the wildest things for me is to see people claim Hebrew is somehow not Semitic because they didn't have a word for, say, shark, and ultimately created a Semiticized version of a loanword from Greek, karish. I chose this in particular because the Arabic word, kirsh, is also a loanword from Greek. They're both from Greek karcharias, forgive my pronunciation, and the word modern Hebrew got it from is a Jewish Babylonian Aramaic word attested earlier than, any writings in Arabic whatsoever. More important point is at play here. Age is not authenticity necessarily. And this is a completely normal way for languages to do things. But people take their ignorance of linguistics and how languages change over time and use them to demonize modern Hebrew in particular. Why modern Hebrew? Well, it's not really about the language. So, does modern Hebrew steal words and concepts? That's a really weird framing for literally how all languages do things. But yeah, sure. Just like English stole panini from Italian and toodaloo from French. Leave me a comment if you want to know the story behind that one. Or buckaroo from Spanish, or ketchup from Chinese, or cabal from Hebrew. And languages sometimes borrow grammatical patterns too, like English long time no see from Chinese, or courts martial and attorneys general and Wells Fargo from French.
The Wells Fargo wagon! The Wells Fargo wagon!
The last one's not true, I made that up.
Oh, the Wells Fargo wagon is a coming down the street.
One big claim is that it's a colonial language. Now, colonialism is the practice of extending and maintaining political, social, economic, and cultural domination over a territory and its people by another people in pursuit of interests defined in an often distant metropole who also claim superiority. Think like Paris or London or Mecca. Colonialism is sometimes developed into settler colonialism, where settlers from one or multiple colonizing metropoles occupy territory with the intention of partially or completely supplanting the existing indigenous peoples. And as a last point, colonialism monopolizes power by understanding conquered land and people to be inferior, based on beliefs of entitlement and superiority justified with beliefs of having a civilizing mission, a mission civilisatrice, to cultivate land and life and, whatever. Colonial languages include English and French, and yes, Spanish. Different video for a different day, but Spanish is not a decolonial underdog. Nahuatl and Mixtec and Quechua, maybe, in the last few hundred years, but also maybe let's not go too far back in time with those. That gets ugly too. Arabic is a colonial language spread from the Arabian Peninsula during the Muslim conquest and imposed on local populations. Hebrew? Not so much. There's no metropole, there's no mission civilisatrice, there's not even entitlement and superiority in general, contrary to the conspiracy theories you might have heard, barring a few loud lunatics. But we don't judge all Canadians on Stéphane Molyneux or Americans based on the statements of Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? Right? There's more than 2 million Arab citizens in Israel, many of whom speak Arabic at home and school and are bilingual with Hebrew. There's also sometimes a claim that modern Hebrew pilfers Arabic for vocabulary, and while this is not more true of Arabic than any other languages Hebrew has historically been in contact with, most notably Aramaic and Greek, there's a bit of an uncomfortable wrinkle in that story. A lot of it, like Yalla, for instance, comes from, yes, Arabic, but Judeo-Arabic. That is, the Arabic spoken by conquered Jewish populations in the Middle East and generally not used by non-Jews. So not the own a lot of propagandists think it is. And that's the thing. A lot of the rhetoric you hear online is from propagandists and bots, and is motivated by religious and theological approaches to politics. So my false belief when I was younger about Hebrew being built out by religious fanatics, most of the people I was painting with that brush may have had a religious education, meaning they already spoke Hebrew very well, but didn't have a set word for a shark eating a tomato. But they were not religious at all, and many were anti-religious. The zealous fanaticism argument kind of crumbles when you actually learn the history. However, here's where I get back to pissing off the other side. Hebrew really was what linguists think of as a dead language. Latin was spoken and written by an educated scribal and religious elite in Christendom, but the hoi polloi spoke like Middle High German and Old French and shit. They didn't call it that at the time because they didn't call it old when they were speaking it, but whatever. Also, I said hoi polloi. Is English a zombie language that steals from other languages because it's not real, or is that just how educated people use language? Leave me a comment with why I'm wrong. And there is now a strain of political thought in some parts of the Jewish world that view the revival of Hebrew as miraculous, simultaneously positing that it was never really dead. It was, but also ascribing theological heft and import to the language of the Bible being spoken again 2,000 years later. Can modern Hebrew speakers read the Bible in the original? Yes, just like how I can read Shakespeare in the original. Meaning, some of the words don't mean the same thing anymore, and some of the grammar is a little different. Just like I might misunderstand what methinks means and assume it's equivalent to I think, I've heard modern Hebrew speakers think that a shekel in the Tanakh referred to a coin. In the sense of ancestry and descent, they're the same language, but they're also different languages, just like how the English of Shakespeare or even Chaucer is still English, but not the same English I speak. Of course, this is just how living languages work, and the same applies to Arabic, Greek, what have you. So, what is modern Hebrew? Well, it's the first known successful large-scale language revitalization. The language was dead, but it was also kind of paradoxically in daily use among Jews who had compulsory education, widespread literacy, and a culture built around daily study in that language. The modern language is not the same as the ancient language, but is clearly continuous with it. It was shaped by a highly motivated group of people, but also by political and social exigencies. One of the big ironies of claiming that Ben Yehuda was the driver of the revival is that while he's the poster child, or rather his child, the first native speaker of modern Hebrew, is the real poster child, I guess, most of his suggestions and coinages didn't catch on, because real people using Hebrew in real communicative contexts ultimately organically settled on something else. Terms from modern concepts were added by committee or organically, just as with other modern languages, and in fact, language planning is just a huge part of decolonial language practice, creating very real problems in Africa and the Americas as well. Is somebody not speaking real Zulu when the Zulu word for rectangle is irectangle? New terms came from repurposing terms whose meaning was lost, from uses in Rabbinic Hebrew, which had a much larger and more robust vocabulary than the Bible, and from the sister language Aramaic, spoken by Jews for centuries, from Greek and Latin, and yes, from Arabic as well, Yiddish, English, and others. Very similar to modern Standard Arabic, or Fusha, in fact. It is still very much a Semitic language, not an amalgam of European languages using Hebrew words. The actual terminology the propagandists are looking for is a contact language or Creole language with a European substrate and Hebrew as a lexifier, but, well, it's not that. As someone who speaks quite a few European languages can attest, it's really not that. It's very different. In a little while, I'll have a video about other language revitalization efforts and whether a fetishization of the past and fossilization of the language ends up creating a scenario in which learners are afraid to really use the language lest they do it wrong. It becomes a museum piece encased in glass to be appreciated but not used. But that's another video for another day. Let me know in the comments what other questions you have or if there's something I didn't address here. There's a lot to dig into. It's a language with an attested written history that spans 4,000 years, so I'm just barely scratching the surface here. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you can support it on YouTube with super thanks or over on Patreon at patreon.com/languagejones. Please leave me a comment, even if it's just to yell at me. They're great for the algorithm, and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, happy learning.